More and more evidence seems to be mounting that the Russian airliner which went down in the Sinai Peninsula last week was the victim of a terror attack. The two countries which have been leading investigations are Egypt and Russia. The Washington Post editorial board says the two countries are now facing a test. Here on the Press Review, we'll look at what the newspaper has to say. Referring to Russia and Egypt, it writes, "It says much about the autocratic regimes that control the two countries that the first word that the destruction of the aircraft might have been a terrorist attack and the first measures to protect the tens of thousands of tourists still in the Sinai came from the government of Britain." The Post goes on to suggest that the UK's steps in the wake of the tragedy have been correct, whilst in Moscow and Cairo, officials have taken a very different direction, seemingly trying to play down the terror attack theory. The paper writes, while Mr. Putin suspended Russian flights on Friday, his spokesman was still insisting that there was no reason to conclude that there had been an act of terrorism. When not issuing his own denials, Egypt's transport minister was obstructing the British evacuation effort, reducing the number of London flights from 29 to 8. So why are Russia and Egypt acting this way? The Washington Post argues that if the two countries admit that the Russian plane was downed by a terror attack, that is tantamount to admitting that their wars on the Islamic State and its affiliates have not been successful. The Post writes, the Sisi and Putin regimes were focused on defending themselves. Both rulers have sold themselves as warriors courageously taking on the Islamic State and its affiliates. Both are using that fight as a pretext to accomplish other ends, such as repressing peaceful domestic opponents and distracting attention from declining living standards. On the actual battlefield, both are failing. The Post argues that Egyptian leader Sisi and Russian President Putin will continue to deny a terror attack took place for as long as possible. The paper suggests that state-controlled media in one or both countries might resort to an old tactic of putting forward far-fetched anti-American alternative theories. The editorial board says, "We won't be surprised if Russians and Egyptians are told the CIA is somehow responsible for the tragedy in the Sinai. Those seeking a more rational conclusion must consider this somber point. The Egyptian and Russian regimes are far less adept at fighting terrorism than they are at lying." So, a thorough condemnation there of the Egyptian and Russian reactions to the downing of the Russian plane in the Sinai last week. The tragedy seems to have brought Moscow and Cairo together, if only in an attempt to throw doubt on pronouncements from more credible sources that a terror attack took place. The information war, which appears to be growing up around the A321 plane, is for some critics beginning to resemble the media storm around MH17, the plane which went down last year whilst flying over East Ukraine and which Western governments believe was hit by a missile fired by Russian-backed militants. That's all we have time for today. Join us again tomorrow for another press review. In Kiev, this is Ukraine Today.